Hi, good morning, everybody, and thank you for having me. It's great to be back here. I've had the pleasure of speaking at a few of these events before, and it's been great to get to know everybody. Thank you to Impact Energy as well for having me, and to Conrad for helping me limit my slide number. I have a tendency to get into some details, especially on the economic side of things. So when you look at my presentation online, you'll see a little bit more information. And so just a little bit about IHS Markit and what we've done, what we've accomplished. We've been working pretty closely with Impact Energy over the last few years, working on understanding the statistics behind the decision making that goes into energy efficiency policy. And so I know that Rita and Conrad will probably talk a little bit more about that, but that's been really fun. So we're market intelligence providers, which means that we engage with the suppliers of this equipment here that you see that we call industrial automation. And that's really important because rather than looking at the products themselves, we get the opportunity to understand what goes into the decision making behind things such as, you know, what do our customers want, what will they want going forward, and how does government policy affect our decision making. So that's been really great, and I'll talk about motors and drives specifically today. When I talk about drives, I'm speaking about variable speed drives, variable frequency drives, etc. And I think we all know what motors are. I'll be talking about low voltage products, low voltage motors, low voltage drives. That means that that's 690 volts and below, just to clarify on the scope of that. A quick note just on the economic side of things is that in Europe, economic sentiment has gone down quite considerably, which has led to manufacturing in general taking a pretty steady decline in the back half of 2018. That's important to understand because those factors can sometimes impact what decisions the motor suppliers are making themselves. Again, I'm not going to get too much into the economic side of things, but we do have the ear of all of the suppliers and get to understand what's the most pressing things for them. Apparently, there's a trade war going on, and that's something that everybody wants to know about. But I don't know what that's about or what country started that. So just getting into the motor market itself, it's just important to understand how big it is. Almost 42 million units shipped every year, and that's just speaking about industrial low voltage motors. So I think that it's important to just understand the scene, who the big players are, and what kind of growth rates. In the Americas specifically, and in North America, that 1.7% growth rate doesn't sound like much. It's actually booming right now in the US, Canada, even Mexico to a degree. But we see that as evening off in the back end of our forecast towards 2021, 22. And then Asia is, of course, the largest and fastest growing region. So just getting into a little bit more about what is the specific layout of the market. You have more information at the top on who the major players are. But I want to talk about what are the main things going on right now. So generally speaking, in terms of energy efficiency, one of the most important factors historically has been the initial investment costs, so the installation costs and things like that. Life cycle costs have not, historically, I'm talking way back before we had these policies, been as much of a factor. Or I'm sorry, the install cost has been. And then as we became more aware of the benefits of energy efficiency, we started focusing a little bit more on that, understanding the benefits of focusing on the life cycle costs, right? Now we have IE4 and IE5 motors have been defined, obviously not implemented as mandated regulations or anything just yet. We've seen a lot of growth in this area, a lot of interest. People are always asking us about it. But as you'll see in a minute, it's less than 2% of the market size. And so we'll see, I have a chart that kind of shows the impact of growth of these by efficiency class and how that aligns with government policy. And so that's really the main driving force there. What's been interesting is that disruptive technologies, especially in the motor and the drive market, have been, it's a mature market. Change tends to happen slowly. But we've seen industrial Internet of Things, which, as most people in Europe would say, is Industry 4.0. It's kind of just the same term, really. But that's like the shift of focusing into connectivity and how we can take the machines from being just machines and looking at how they're all interconnected and how we can use that for asset tracking, for business analytics, and yes, of course, advancing energy savings. So in some ways, the focus towards IoT has been a bit of a headwind to the development of energy efficiency, but in other ways, we've also seen energy savings as a result of that. So this is the chart that I was talking about, and it's just kind of a snapshot of some of the key efficiency policies that have come out over the years. This is a look at 2010 to 2020, obviously, and this is in terms of units shipped, so motors shipped. You can see whenever a policy comes out, that tends to be leading, there's a little bit of a lag, right? So after all these policies at the top, Brazil, EU, and China, that's when we really start to see IE1 motors shift down. There's always going to be a market for the less efficient motors, especially in less developed regions, because there's loopholes, there's our applications where it doesn't really need to be that efficient. But largely, we've seen a big jump in IE2 and IE3 motors. And you can look at the numbers really specifically and see when there was a market downturn, but that doesn't really affect the transition because by and large, the end users are more knowledgeable. The suppliers are more able to sell the benefits of life cycle improvement of energy efficiency. And so this chart kind of looks at the transition that you'll see that we expect looking at 2016 compared to what we think the market will look like in 2022. You see a really huge drop-off in the IE1 motors, but 25% is still quite a bit. But that's a big drop going just looking at 6-year difference, right? So IE3 seems to have the biggest growth from 18% to 26%. That change has largely happened in areas like the US. We think that the biggest area for growth of IE3 motors is, of course, in Europe, whereas the current situation leads to kind of a decision between do you combine the IE2 motor with the VFD, or do you buy the IE3 motor? And so that's very application specific. But one thing that's helping grow that is an Internet of Things and this decision by suppliers to focus on the applications and get to know the supplier a lot better, get themselves involved in the chain, and show that they have the expertise to provide the services needed. So when a manufacturer gets involved with the life cycle of the end user itself, that's really helpful to understanding exactly the right kind of motor needed for that application. And so I think that's been really helpful. At the same time, emerging technologies like IoT can also take the focus away from selling a higher efficient motor. So there's marginal returns obviously going from an IE2 to an IE3 versus an IE3 to an IE4. And I think that in a large sense, the market gets that and sees that, especially since there's no impetus. So IE4 motors will still be just about 2% by 2022 in terms of how many motors are shipped globally. Now, it's also important to understand, I mentioned applications and where the motors end up. So pumps, fans, and compressors, that's going to be a huge topic of discussion this week. That's because it makes up about 80% of motor shipments on an annual basis. That's a huge number, and so when you consider looking at the industrial automation market in general, motors are accounting for a very, very large majority of electricity consumption. Well, that means that pumps, fans, and compressors are very much so at the heart of that. And so it's important to understand where the money is, and I think that these are actually, despite how big the market is, it's low-hanging fruit in terms of energy efficiency. And that's for a lot of reasons. When you compare the US and Europe for their push towards system efficiency, I think that there's a difference in approach. And so Europe has historically been more focused on the systems efficiency, and I think that that's kind of seeped into not just North America, but also in Asia. And you see more and more companies focused on how can we get better motors, better fitting motors, but also fitting the right pumps, fans, compressors with that motor and implementing a drive. And so speaking of drives, the green on here represents what percentage of the pump, fan, compressor shipments actually have a drive attached to it. It's a surprisingly low number, and when you look at really energy-intensive applications, that number tends to go up a little bit, but there's a lot of areas that need improvement, like water and wastewater and HVAC. In a lot of water plants, I think the average number is about 10% of motors have a drive attached to them. So that's a really low number, and I think that we're going to start seeing that grow a lot faster. So a similar slide now, I'm looking at drives specifically. So it's about half the market size, just to kind of put it in perspective, but a much faster growth rate. There's a lot more interest in adopting drives in the installed base. That's a big focus for not just drives, but also sensor technology, so the ability to track and monitor equipment. That's a huge focus, and so drives play a huge part in the energy efficiency of motors, but also in the push for advanced IoT technologies. Looking at what's just kind of going on in the drives market, IoT, like I said, that's a huge part of what's going on. So the energy intensive applications have a lot of room to improve as far as what are the growth prospect industries. It sometimes sorts itself out when you look at more on the medium voltage side of things. You kind of have to have a drive. You have to have an efficient motor, because if it fails, if it's not operating properly, you're just losing too much money. When you get down to lower applications like HVAC, where sometimes it's the consumer directly making that decision, that can be a little bit tricky, because there's still a lack of education broadly in terms of who understands the benefits of energy efficiency, but this largely changes based on the economic climate. When municipalities have lower budgets, they don't focus on revamping or fixing infrastructure. When the costs are higher, people typically have to cut budgets, and the first thing that goes is focusing on the luxury type items. So the other things that go into that, we have an aging workforce in a lot of major regions, as well as a decline in the skill level of engineers. When we have a downturn, that's typically a job that has been cut by a lot of suppliers. And so I think that they've realized that that might not be the way to go about it, because being able to separate yourself and focus on the services sector has been a huge part, not just improving efficiency, but also in kind of separating yourself as an expert in the market. And that's really where the demand is. So just kind of looking at emerging technologies, IoT is certainly one of them, but transformative technology, it's a new group that we actually started at IHS Markit. And that's really big, because it's more than just IoT and being connected. How can you use the cloud and artificial intelligence, for example, to really bring it all together? And so eventually that will certainly boost energy efficiency, as well as just the overall understanding of where the market's going. And that's really important, because you'll see from these next few slides here, it's really not about suppliers positioning themselves as experts in a product, but experts in a whole technology, in a whole service. So really broadening that expertise. Just kind of looking at how IoT has evolved. And I'm talking about IoT because, again, I think I've tied in a little bit how it's important to energy efficiency, but it's really the main focus. When you look at the main suppliers of motors, drives, and other industrial automation equipment, even gearboxes and valves and seals and all of those manufacturers, they're really looking at how they can incorporate this kind of technology. So it was initially just, okay, let's connecting devices. But really, what you do with that data is more important. And so I think that's where the skills gap exists right now. So being able to look at those energy analytics and say, okay, well, how can we improve this? How can we maybe change the lead time? How can we improve the services sector? And so really what that leads to is the big data and the unique value in being able to separate yourself. Because what we have right now is a homogenized market. when you have a mandate of IE3 motors and everybody's compliant, everybody's at this level, you don't have that benefit of saying, okay, well, we're more efficient than so-and-so. And then if you are, especially when the level is IE3, like I said, there's marginal returns. So the focus is largely shifted to this type of stuff. As an example, predictive maintenance is one of the biggest things that we hear from our suppliers in terms of what they're focusing on and why that's important. If you're selling a vibration sensor component, for example, the margin for you is pretty minimal. It's not as much of an expensive product. And without getting too into the details, the gist of it is, as you get into predictive maintenance and maybe not focusing on the hardware, focusing on the service, on the software, on a solution, essentially, that is really where people are starting to realize the money is. So if you're basically putting yourself in a position to not sell the hardware, but the guarantee that the hardware won't fail, that's really the end goal of IoT solutions, of really all of the transformative technologies that we've talked about. And so that ties in really nicely, I think, with energy efficiency. And so when people say that they're clashing the two technologies, people aren't maybe focusing on the energy efficiency anymore. That's really not true. So we still see the numbers show that we're seeing high growth rates for IE3 motors, and IE4 motors have never grown faster in the last couple of years. So that's really exciting. And then I talk a little bit about the connectivity in terms of a connected device basically means that it can communicate. You can track the condition of an asset. And so motors, and as of 2016, less than 5% were enabled for that kind of technology. And then even of those, even fewer were actually connected and utilized properly. So it's a very small market size, kind of like when you look at the connection of drives with a fan or a pump. So there's a huge growth rate, and so this is another area where people are focusing on. In 2019, you're going to see a lot more smart motors on the market, not just focusing on the installed base or in revamping projects, but you're going to see more greenfield installations with smart and connected motors. It's going to be a slow process, of course, but I think that would largely be an area of the future. Similarly with drives, there's challenges associated with that, but the biggest one is that consumers need to recognize a return on investment, and that's the biggest thing right now, is just the lack of education. So similar to how suppliers are still focusing on educating their customers, their partners, their distributors on the benefits of energy efficiency, it's also the benefits of connected devices, of using that IoT technology. So one of the biggest things is just kind of broadening the expertise, being able to kind of explain the benefits of that, but not only that, but also understanding, okay, we can collect data, but a lot of people can do that. That's actually been around for quite a while. It just became a buzzword about 5 years ago, though. And so I think that a lot of motor suppliers are kind of wondering why it's the buzzword now. And it's just because more people are kind of being more aware of it, and they see that they need to differentiate themselves. And so this is a little survey that we did a few years back, looking at IoT application versus planned installment. And so we asked, what are the most useful IoT applications for your company? And so the dark blue indicates that they use the application, or they plan to within the next 3 years. And then the gray would kind of say, oh, it's interesting, but we don't really have a plan yet. And then the backside kind of indicates that there was no interest. And so we're going to redo this survey and kind of understand what's changed. And so you can see the main uses of it would be asset tracking, business analytics, and energy analytics was also a big one. And so that's an example of how they're working together, and how I think that the next 5 to 10 years is going to shake out. We'll see a lot more on the blue side, and I think we'll see a big increase in the use of energy analytics. And so how that combines with government policy and the growth of IE3, IE4, IE5 motors, I'm pretty excited to see how that shakes out. So in conclusion, we're going to keep seeing energy efficiency improve. I think that IoT can certainly have the opportunity to work with it or dwarf the benefits, but probably we're going to see both interact pretty successfully. The full solution offerings is really the best business model, as we've talked about before. And then really, I think it's just kind of looking at the focus of the suppliers themselves, broadening that expertise. And that's it.